"Did you enjoy paying off the house, Mom?" my son asked, smiling as he leaned back in his chair. And I remember thinking that after 32 years of early mornings, double shifts, and counting every dollar twice before spending it once, that question should have felt like a victory, like a finish line I had been crawling toward my entire adult life. But before I could answer, before I could even let myself feel proud, my daughter-in-law Ashley set her fork down with a soft click and said, almost casually, "Good, because now you can finally move out." And for a moment, the words didn't make sense. They just hung there in the air between us like something misplaced, like a sentence that had wandered into the wrong conversation. And I actually smiled, a small, confused smile, the kind you give when you're sure you must have misheard, because surely no one says something like that on a day like this. Not on the day you hand over the final payment on the only home you've ever owned. Not on the day you finally breathe again after decades of holding that quiet fear in your chest. That one unexpected bill, one bad month, could take everything away, and yet neither of them laughed. Neither of them corrected it. Daniel just kept looking at me with that same polite, distant expression he'd been wearing all evening, the one that never quite reached his eyes. And Ashley folded her hands neatly on the table as if she had just made a reasonable suggestion, something practical, something obvious. And that was the moment something inside me shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, just a small, precise click, like a lock turning somewhere deep in my chest. Because I realized then that this wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a joke. This was something they had already decided, something they had likely talked about long before this dinner, long before I sat across from them with the receipt still tucked carefully in my purse. The proof that the mortgage was finally gone, that the house on Willow Creek Drive was mine, completely and fully mine, or at least, that's what I had believed for the past 3 decades. I remember looking down at my hands resting on the table, noticing the faint calluses along my fingers, the thin white line across my knuckle from a factory job I worked in my 40s, the subtle tremor that had started showing up in the past year, and thinking how strange it was that these were the hands that had built everything I had. And yet somehow, in this moment, I felt like a guest in my own life, like I had been invited to a celebration that wasn't really for me. "I'm not sure I understand," I said finally, my voice calm, steadier than I felt. Because that's how I had always handled things, quietly, carefully, without making a scene. And Ashley tilted her head slightly, offering me a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Daniel and I have been talking," she said, her tone soft but firm. "This house is too much for one person, and now that it's paid off, it just makes sense to reorganize things." Reorganize. That was the word she chose. As if my life, my home, the place where I had raised my son and buried my husband, could be sorted and rearranged like furniture. And I turned to Daniel then, waiting, hoping, maybe foolishly, that he would say something, that he would laugh it off or shake his head or simply tell me this was all a misunderstanding. But he didn't. He just nodded once, slowly, and said, "It's for the best, Mom." And that was when I realized that whatever this was, whatever had been decided without me, it had already begun, long before I ever made that final payment, long before I ever thought to question whether the home I had spent my entire life paying for still belonged to me at all. I did not argue with them that night. I did not raise my voice or demand explanations, because somewhere deep down I already knew that whatever answer they gave me would not be the truth I needed. So I simply nodded, picked up my purse, and told them I would think about what they said. And as I walked out of that dining room, past the hallway where I had once measured Daniel's height in pencil marks that were still faintly visible on the wall, I felt something unfamiliar settle over me. Not anger, not even sadness, but a quiet kind of clarity that made everything around me seem sharper, more defined, like I was seeing my own life from a distance for the first time. The drive home was only 15 minutes, the same route I had taken thousands of times over the years, but that night every streetlight, every stop sign, every familiar house felt slightly different, as if the world had shifted just enough for me to notice that I no longer stood at the center of it. When I pulled into the driveway and stepped out of the car, I paused for a moment and looked at the house, really looked at it. The pale blue siding that needed repainting, the porch light that flickered slightly before settling into a steady glow, the front steps worn smooth in the middle from decades of use. This was the place where I had carried groceries in after long shifts, where I had sat on the porch with my husband during quiet summer evenings, where I had watched my son run through the yard chasing fireflies. And yet as I stood there that night, I felt like I was standing outside of something that no longer belonged to me in the way I had always believed it did. Inside, the house was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that feels heavier than usual. I set my purse down on the kitchen counter and reached for the envelope I had placed there earlier that morning, the one that contained the final mortgage statement, stamped and dated, proof that the debt was gone. I ran my fingers over the paper, tracing the numbers as if they might change if I looked at them long enough. 32 years reduced to a few lines of printed text. It should have felt like closure, like relief, but instead it felt incomplete, like a sentence that ended too soon. I poured myself a glass of water and sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I had balanced bills and budgets for decades, and I began to think back, not just to the years of payments, but to everything that came before them. The second job I took when Daniel was in middle school, because the interest rate had gone up. The weekends I spent doing bookkeeping for a small local business to cover unexpected repairs. The vacations I never took, the small things I went without, all of it had been worth it, or at least that is what I had always told myself, because it was not just a house, it was security, it was stability, it was something I could pass on, something that meant my son would always have a place to come back to. And that belief had carried me through years that might have otherwise broken me. But now, sitting there with that piece of paper in my hand, I started to wonder when exactly that belief had stopped being shared, when Daniel had begun to see this house not as something we built together, but as something he could simply take over. When Ashley had started speaking about it as if I were already gone, I stood up slowly and walked through the house, moving from room to room. The living room with the faded rug I had bought on clearance 20 years ago, the hallway with family photos that seemed to belong to a different version of us, the bedroom where my husband's old reading chair still sat by the window, untouched, as if he might come back and sit in it at any moment. Everything looked the same, and yet nothing felt the same, because for the first time, I realized that I might not actually understand what had been happening around me, that decisions had been made, conversations had taken place, and plans had been formed without me even knowing. And as that thought settled in, I felt that same quiet clarity return, stronger this time, more focused. Because if there was one thing I had learned over the years, it was that when something does not make sense, when the numbers do not add up, you do not ignore it, you do not accept it at face value. You sit down, you go through every detail, and you find the truth, no matter how long it takes. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, not because I had somewhere to be, but because my mind refused to stay quiet. The same thoughts circling again and again. Something was not right, and I had learned a long time ago that when something feels wrong, it usually is. I made coffee the way I always did. 2 scoops, a splash of milk, nothing fancy, and stood by the kitchen window watching the sunlight slowly fill the backyard. The same backyard where Daniel used to play for hours, where I had planted a small maple tree the year we moved in, now tall enough to cast shade across half the lawn. Everything looked normal, peaceful even. But that sense of normalcy only made the unease stronger, because it meant whatever had changed was not visible on the surface. I sat down at the table with my coffee and the mortgage statement in front of me, and for the first time, I really studied it. Not just the final balance, but every detail, every line of print, the loan number, the servicing company, the dates, and something about it felt incomplete. Not wrong exactly, but not as straightforward as I had expected after all these years. I could not explain it in that moment, but it was enough to push me out of the house an hour later with my purse and a folder of old documents I had kept organized for decades, statements, tax records, anything that had ever seemed important. I drove to the bank where I had held the account for over 20 years, the same branch with the same brick exterior and neatly trimmed hedges, and as I walked inside, I was greeted by a young woman at the front desk who smiled politely and asked how she could help. I told her I needed to review my mortgage records, that I had just completed the final payment and wanted to confirm everything was closed properly. She nodded and directed me to sit with a banker, a man named Thomas Reed, who introduced himself with a firm handshake and an easy smile, the kind that suggested he had done this 1,000 times before. I explained my situation again, keeping my voice calm and measured, and he began typing into his computer, his fingers moving quickly across the keyboard as he pulled up my account. For a few moments, there was only the soft sound of keys and the faint hum of the office around us. And then I noticed it, the slight pause in his movement. The way his expression shifted just enough to catch my attention. Not alarm, not concern, but something closer to curiosity, as if he had come across something unexpected. I felt my grip tighten slightly on the edge of my purse. "Is everything all right?" I asked, and he glanced up at me with a polite smile that did not quite hide the change in his demeanor. "Everything is processed," he said carefully. "The mortgage is indeed paid in full." He turned the screen slightly as if to reassure me, but then he hesitated again, and that hesitation was enough to confirm what I had already begun to suspect. There was more to this than a simple closed account. "However," he continued, choosing his words with a level of precision that made my chest feel suddenly tight, "there are some additional documents tied to the property that you may want to review." Additional documents. I repeated the phrase silently in my mind, letting it settle, letting it expand, because that was not something I had expected to hear, not after 32 years of handling every payment, every bill, every detail connected to that house. "What kind of documents?" I asked, and this time, his answer came with a slight shift in tone, more formal now, more deliberate. "Ownership and trust-related filings," he said, and for a moment, the room seemed to grow quieter around me, the words hanging there with a weight I could not yet fully understand. Ownership and trust. I had never set up a trust, not that I could remember, and yet here it was, attached to the one thing in my life I thought I understood completely. I nodded slowly, keeping my expression neutral, the same way I had learned to do in situations where reacting too quickly would only cloud my judgment. "I would like to see everything," I said, and as he began to gather the necessary documents, I realized that whatever answers I had come looking for that morning, I was about to find something far more complicated, something that had been sitting quietly beneath the surface of my life. Waiting for the moment, I finally decided to look closely enough to see it. Thomas placed a thin stack of papers in front of me, not thick or overwhelming, just enough to suggest that whatever had been hidden was done carefully, deliberately. And as I reached for the top page, I noticed immediately that this was not something I had ever seen before, not in all the years I had signed documents at closing tables or sat across from loan officers. Reviewing terms. This was different. The heading alone told me that a formal trust document with language that felt both precise and distant, the kind of language that does not invite questions but quietly answers them before you even think to ask. I began reading slowly, line by line, not because I could not understand the words, but because I wanted to be sure I did not miss anything, and with each sentence, something inside me shifted further. The name listed as the primary beneficiary was mine, Margaret Collins, clearly stated, unmistakable, and yet the structure described below, it was not something I had ever been told about, not by the bank, not by any attorney I remembered speaking with, and certainly not by my husband, who had always handled the more complex aspects of our finances. I paused there, my eyes lingering on his name as it appeared further down in the document, listed as the original grantor, and for a moment, I was no longer sitting in that office but standing in our old kitchen years ago, watching him review paperwork with that same quiet focus he applied to everything. He had always been careful, always believed in planning ahead, and making sure that nothing was left to chance. I remembered him once telling me that security was not something you hoped for. It was something you built piece by piece, and at the time, I had trusted that whatever he was building, it would take care of us both. What I had not realized was just how much he had done without ever explaining it fully. I turned the page and continued reading, and that was when the pieces began to come together in a way that made my chest tighten. The trust was not just a formality. It was a protective structure, one that placed the house under its control, not directly under any individual ownership in the way I had assumed, which meant that any attempt to transfer or claim it would be subject to conditions that were outlined in careful detail across the following pages. I felt a slow, steady realization begin to form, not sudden, not dramatic, but clear and undeniable. If this document was still active, if it had not been altered or dissolved, then the house was not something that could simply be taken or reassigned based on a conversation at a dinner table. It did not matter what Daniel believed or what Ashley had suggested. There were rules in place, legal ones, and they existed whether anyone acknowledged them or not. I looked up briefly and saw Thomas watching me with a neutral, professional expression, as if he had seen this moment before in other clients. The moment when confusion gives way to understanding, and understanding begins to shift into something else entirely, something quieter, more focused. Has this been changed recently? I asked, keeping my voice even, and he shook his head. No, ma'am. These filings have been in place for several years. The words echoed in my mind as I looked back down at the document, because that meant this was not new, not something created in response to recent events. This had been there all along, beneath everything I thought I understood about my own home. And I realized then that whatever Daniel and Ashley had planned, whatever assumptions they had made about what would happen next, they had done so without fully knowing what they were dealing with. And as that thought settled in, I felt that same quiet clarity return once more, stronger now, sharper, because for the first time since that conversation at the dinner table, I was no longer trying to understand their intentions. I was beginning to understand my position, and more importantly, the truth that had been waiting for me to find it. By the time I left the bank, the envelope in my hands felt heavier than it should have, not because of the paper itself, but because of what it represented, a version of my life that had existed quietly in the background while I moved forward believing something entirely different. I sat in my car for several minutes before starting the engine, reading through the documents again, slower this time, tracing each clause as if I were mapping out a path I had never known I was walking. The language was clear in a way that left very little room for interpretation. The trust did not simply protect the house. It defined who could control it, who could benefit from it, and under what conditions any changes could be made. And as I read, I began to notice something even more important. There were restrictions, carefully written, almost understated, but unmistakable. No transfer of control could occur without my direct authorization. No sale, no reassignment, no restructuring of ownership unless I signed off on it personally, which meant one thing that settled into my mind with a quiet certainty. Nothing had changed, not legally, not in any way that mattered, whatever Daniel and Ashley believed, whatever they had told themselves or each other. It did not align with the reality documented in front of me. I leaned back in the driver's seat and closed my eyes for a moment, not out of exhaustion, but to steady the shift happening inside me, because this was not just about a house. It was about understanding how easily perception could be shaped when you were not paying attention, how decisions could be made around you when you assumed you were still part of the conversation. I thought back to the past few years, the small changes that had seemed insignificant at the time, Daniel offering to help with paperwork, Ashley suggesting it might be easier if they handled certain bills. The subtle way conversations about finances had become less frequent, less detailed, until eventually they stopped altogether. At the time, I had seen it as a kindness, a sign that I no longer needed to carry everything on my own. But now, looking at it through the clarity these documents provided, I saw something else, not necessarily a plan, not something calculated from the beginning, but a gradual shift in control, one that relied on my willingness to step back, to trust, to believe that my role had not changed even as the structure around me quietly did. I opened my eyes and looked down at the final page in the stack, where my name appeared again, this time in a section outlining authority. And there it was, plainly stated, I was not just a beneficiary, I was the controlling party, the one with the final say over any decision related to the property. I read that line twice, then a third time, not because I doubted it, but because I wanted to fully absorb what it meant. For the first time since that dinner, I felt something solid return beneath my feet. Not anger, not the urge to confront or correct them immediately, but something far more useful, understanding, because now I knew exactly where I stood, and more importantly, where they did not. I started the car then, the engine humming softly as I pulled out of the parking lot, and as I drove back toward the house. I did not feel like someone returning to a place she might lose. I felt like someone walking into a situation she finally understood, and that difference, though quiet, changed everything. When I stepped back into the house that afternoon, nothing looked different. The same quiet rooms, the same light coming through the windows, the same faint creak in the floor near the hallway. And yet everything felt sharper, more defined, as if I had adjusted a lens I did not realize was out of focus before. I I set the envelope down on the kitchen counter and stood there for a moment, letting the silence settle around me. Because for the first time in a long while, I was not reacting, I was deciding. I walked to the small desk in the corner of the living room where I kept my documents and opened the bottom drawer, the one I had not touched in months. Inside were neatly labeled folders, years of records I had never thrown away, tax returns, insurance policies, old correspondence, the kind of things most people forget about until they need them. And as I flipped through them, I realized how much of my life had been built on this habit of keeping track, of not letting details slip away. Even when everything seemed stable, even when there was no immediate reason to question anything, I pulled out a blank notepad and sat down, not to write something emotional or reactive, but to organize what I knew, what I had just learned, and what still needed to be confirmed. I wrote down the name of the trust, the filing dates, the specific clauses that define control, each point simple, clear, and grounded in the documents I had just reviewed, because I understood something now that I had not fully understood before. Information is only useful if you know how to hold it steady. If you do not let it turn into noise or confusion. I did not need to confront Daniel or Ashley yet. I did not need to explain anything or defend my position. What I needed was clarity, complete and undeniable. I reached for my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found a name I had not called in years, Patricia Langford, the attorney who had helped my husband finalize several business agreements before he retired. She had always been precise, direct, the kind of person who did not waste time on assumptions. I hesitated for a moment, not out of doubt, but because I knew that once I made this call, I was stepping fully into something that could not be undone. Then I pressed dial. The line rang twice before her voice came through, steady and professional. And as I introduced myself, I could hear the slight shift in her tone, recognition settling in. I explained only the essentials, that I had discovered a trust connected to my home and needed a full legal review. Nothing more, no mention of Daniel, no mention of Ashley, just the facts, because facts were what mattered now. She agreed to meet the next morning, and after I ended the call, I felt that same quiet steadiness return, stronger this time, more grounded. I spent the rest of the afternoon going through the house with a different kind of attention, not as someone preparing to leave, but as someone confirming what was hers. I opened drawers, checked filing cabinets, reviewed small details I had once taken for granted, and with each step, the picture became clearer. There had been no official change, no legal shift in ownership, nothing that supported what I had been told at that dinner table. And as evening approached, I made myself a simple meal and sat alone at the table, the same place where everything had seemed to fall apart the night before. But now, the silence felt different, not heavy, not uncertain, but steady, because I was no longer trying to understand their version of events. I was building my own understanding, piece by piece, and I knew, with a certainty that did not need to be spoken out loud, that whatever happened next would not be decided by assumptions or pressure. It would be decided by what was real, and for the first time since they told me to leave, I was ready for that. The next morning arrived quietly, almost too quietly, as if the house itself was waiting to see what I would do next. I dressed carefully, not out of habit, but with intention, choosing a simple navy blouse and a pair of slacks that had always made me feel composed, because I understood now that how I carried myself mattered, not to them, but to me. And by the time I stepped out the front door, the envelope was already in my bag, organized, aligned, every document in its place. Patricia's office was downtown, about 20 minutes away, in a building I had passed many times but never entered on my own. And as I walked through the glass doors and into the lobby, I felt that same steady clarity settle over me again. Not nerves, not hesitation, just focus. Her assistant greeted me by name and led me into a quiet conference room with a long table and a single window that looked out over the street below. And when Patricia walked in a few minutes later, she greeted me with the same direct, attentive presence I remembered. No small talk, no unnecessary warmth, just a simple acknowledgement and a seat across from me. I placed the documents on the table and slid them toward her without explanation, because I did not need to tell her a story. The papers would do that on their own. She read in silence for several minutes, turning each page carefully, her expression unchanged. And I watched her the way I had learned to watch people over the years, not for what they said, but for What they noticed, the slight pause at certain clauses, the way her eyes lingered on specific lines, and when she finally looked up, there was something in her expression that confirmed what I had already begun to understand. This was set up very deliberately, she said, her voice calm, precise. Your husband created a structure that places full control with you, not just in name, but in authority. I nodded once, letting her continue, because I wanted to hear it from someone who understood the law better than I ever could. No one can remove you from this property, she added, and no one can claim it without your explicit consent, not even your son. The words settled into the room with a quiet weight, not dramatic, not surprising, but final in a way that left no room for interpretation. I felt my shoulders relax slightly, not out of relief, but out of confirmation, because now it was no longer just something I believed based on what I had read. It was something verified, grounded, real. Has anything been filed recently that would suggest an attempt to change this? I asked, and she shook her head. Nothing that holds legal standing, she replied. If there were attempts, they were incomplete or informal at best. Informal. The word lingered with me as I considered everything Daniel and Ashley had said, everything they seemed so certain about, and I realized that their confidence had not come from fact. It had come from assumption, from the idea that I would not question, that I would accept their version of events without looking deeper. Patricia closed the folder and rested her hands on top of it. You have full authority here, she said simply, and that was when the final piece settled into place, not just understanding, but position, because knowing the truth was one thing, but knowing what to do with it was something else entirely. I gathered the documents and placed them back into my bag, thanking her for her time, and as I walked out of that office and back into the daylight, the world did not feel different, but I did, because I was no longer standing in uncertainty. I was standing in something solid, something defined, and for the first time since that dinner, I was not thinking about what they had told me to do. I was thinking about what I would choose to do next, and that difference, quiet as it was, changed everything. I did not go home right away after leaving Patricia's office. Instead, I drove slowly through the neighborhood, past familiar streets and houses that had once felt like part of a shared life, but now seemed like quiet observers to something unfolding that no one else could see. I was not rushing anymore, not reacting. I was choosing my pace carefully, because I understood that what came next was not about proving anything. It was about positioning. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the afternoon light had softened, casting long shadows across the front yard, and for a brief moment, I sat there with my hands resting on the steering wheel, not out of hesitation, but to mark the shift, because the person who had left this house the day before and the person returning now were not the same. I stepped inside and set my bag down in the same place as always, but this time, I did not walk through the house looking for reassurance. I moved with purpose, straight to the desk where I kept my documents, and I began to prepare, not in a hurried or emotional way, but with the same careful attention I had used for years managing every bill and responsibility. I organized copies of the trust documents, placed them in a clean folder, and wrote down a few key points on a notepad, not to memorize them, but to keep my thoughts clear and steady, because I knew there would be a moment soon when everything would need to be said without confusion. I reached for my phone and sent a simple message to Daniel, asking him and Ashley to come by that evening. Nothing urgent in my tone, nothing that suggested what I had discovered, just a quiet request. And when he responded a few minutes later with a brief confirmation, I placed the phone back down without overthinking it. The rest of the afternoon passed in a calm, almost deliberate rhythm. I prepared a simple dinner, set the table for 3, and moved through each task with the same steady focus, because I was not preparing for a confrontation. I was preparing for clarity. When the doorbell rang just after 6, I walked to the door and opened it without hesitation. Daniel stood there with Ashley beside him, both of them carrying the same composed expressions I had seen the night before, polite, controlled, and slightly distant, as if they were stepping into a conversation they believed had already been decided. I greeted them and led them inside, and as we sat down at the table, I noticed the small details again. The way Daniel avoided direct eye contact, the way Ashley's posture remained perfectly upright, her hands resting lightly in her lap, waiting, observing. And for a moment, there was silence, the kind that usually invites someone to fill it quickly, to smooth things over, to avoid discomfort. But I let it sit there, because I was no longer trying to ease anything. I was allowing the moment to settle into its true shape. I reached for the folder beside me and placed it gently on the table, not pushing it forward, not drawing attention to it, just setting it down as part of the space between us. And then I looked at them, not with accusation, not with anger, but with a calm that came from knowing exactly where I stood. I went to the bank yesterday, I said, my voice even, measured, and I watched as both of them shifted slightly, not dramatically, but enough to show that this was not the direction they had expected. Ashley's eyes moved briefly toward Daniel before returning to me, and he leaned forward just slightly, as if preparing to respond, but I did not rush. I did not fill the silence for them. I simply continued, laying out the facts one by one, not as a challenge, not as a defense, but as something that did not require interpretation. And as I spoke, I could see it begin to change, not the situation itself, but their understanding of it, because for the first time, this was no longer a conversation built on assumption. It was grounded in something they had not accounted for, something that had been there long before any of us sat at this table. And I realized then that the outcome was no longer uncertain. It had already begun to take shape. The moment I chose to look deeper instead of walking away. Daniel was the first to speak, his voice quieter than usual, as if he was trying to find the right tone for a situation he no longer fully understood. "Mom, we were just trying to make things easier for everyone," he said, and I noticed the way he avoided looking directly at the folder on the table, as if not seeing it might somehow make it less real. Ashley, however, did not look away. Her expression remained composed, but there was a slight tightening around her eyes, a subtle shift that told me she was recalculating, adjusting to information she had not expected to face. I let Daniel's words settle without interrupting, because this was not about arguing over intentions. It was about clarity, and clarity does not require volume. "I understand what you thought you were doing," I replied, my voice steady, not sharp, not defensive, just precise. "But what you thought and what is actually in place are two very different things." I reached for the folder and opened it slowly, turning it toward them so they could see the documents clearly, not pushing it forward, not forcing it into their hands, just placing it where it could not be ignored. "This house is not something that can be reassigned based on a conversation," I continued, keeping my tone even. "It is held in a trust, one that gives me full control over any decision related to it." Daniel's eyes moved across the page, his brow tightening slightly as he read, and I could see the moment the realization began to take hold, not all at once, but piece by piece. Ashley leaned in just enough to follow along, her posture still controlled, but the confidence that had been there the night before was no longer as steady. "There have been no changes to that structure," I added, "and there cannot be without my direct approval." The room grew quiet again, but this time the silence was different. It was no longer uncertain or expectant. It was settling, grounding itself in something that could not be easily dismissed. Daniel leaned back slowly, exhaling as if he had been holding his breath without realizing it. "I did not know," he said finally, his voice softer now, less certain, and I believed him in that moment, not because it excused anything, but because it fit with what I had come to understand. Assumptions had been made, roles had been shifted without question, and somewhere along the way, he had stopped asking whether those assumptions were true. Ashley did not speak immediately, and when she did, her words were measured, careful. "We thought this was the logical next step," she said, choosing each word with precision. "But logic without facts is just guesswork," and for the first time, that difference was visible between us. I closed the folder gently and rested my hands on the table, not to signal the end of the conversation, but to steady it, to bring it back to something simple and clear. "This is my home," I said, not with force, not with anger, but with a certainty that did not need emphasis. "And I am not going anywhere." The words were not dramatic. They did not need to be, because they were backed by something far stronger than emotion. They were backed by truth, and that truth had already shifted everything that needed to change. Daniel nodded slowly, still processing, still adjusting to a reality he had not expected, and Ashley sat back in her chair, her expression composed once again, but quieter now, less certain, as if she was beginning to understand that whatever plans had been made before this moment no longer held the same weight. I looked at both of them, not with resentment, not with triumph, but with a calm that came from knowing exactly where I stood, because this was never about winning. It was about not losing something that had always been mine, and as the silence settled once more around the table, I realized that nothing else needed to be said. The truth had already done its work, and for the first time since they told me to leave, the house felt like mine again, not just in memory, not just in effort, but in reality, exactly as it had always been.